What if the person you thought you knew had a life full of sacrifices you never imagined? This funeral changed everything. The crowded Cypress Grove Cemetery stood solemnly around the freshly dug grave, their quiet murmurs carried away by a gentle breeze. A mix of family, friends, and acquaintances had gathered to pay their respects to Robert Henley, a man revered for his charitable work and warm presence in the community. The polished black headstone gleamed in the afternoon sun, etched with the words, "A life of service and sacrifice." Among the mourners, an elderly black woman stood out, though not by intention. Her deep green dress flowed modestly around her, and her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath a simple hat. She clutched a single red rose, her hands steady, but her eyes betrayed a weight of emotion far heavier than those around her. While others exchanged pleasantries, few acknowledged her. She remained silent, standing at the edge of the crowd, her presence both commanding and understated. It wasn't until the pastor concluded his final prayer that she stepped forward, slowly making her way to the front. The crunch of gravel beneath her heels was the only sound as the mourners parted to let her through. When she reached the grave, she paused, looking down at the polished casket. Then, with great care, she placed the rose on top and turned to face the crowd. "My name is Hattie DeLay," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Robert better than anyone here." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Faces turned to one another, brows furrowed, mouths whispered in curiosity. Who was this woman? How could she claim such a deep connection to the man they all thought they knew so well? Hattie's gaze swept over the sea of faces, her expression calm yet resolute. "Before today ends, you'll understand why I'm here," she said. "And you'll understand the Robert Henley most of you never knew." Her words hung in the air, thick with an unspoken promise. But what Hattie was about to share would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the man they had come to honor. The murmurs had subsided, leaving only the rustle of leaves as Hattie drew in a deep breath. Her voice carried a calm authority, compelling everyone to listen. "I met Robert 50 years ago," she began, her gaze distant as if the memories were playing before her. "It wasn't here in this town. It was in Montgomery, Alabama, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Hattie continued, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "Robert was just a young man then, full of fire and ambition. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was in the civil rights movement. That's where we crossed paths, on the steps of a church, where we were organizing sit-ins. He wasn't afraid to stand beside me, even when it meant losing his job or facing threats." Gasps rippled through the group. The Robert they had known was generous and kind, but none had ever heard of his involvement in such struggles. Hattie let the weight of her words settle before pressing on. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice," she said, her voice softening. "We were friends. No, more than friends. We became each other's family when the world seemed determined to tear us apart." She took a deep breath before continuing. "He was there for me when I lost my sister to the violence of those times. And I was there for him when he had to rebuild his life after being ostracized by his own." Hattie's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat, her gaze fixed on the casket. "We shared meals, stories, tears. He called me his sister in every way that mattered, even when it wasn't safe for him to say it out loud." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the gravity of her words sinking in. It was hard to reconcile this image of Robert with the man they knew, a polished philanthropist who had quietly helped many, but never spoke of his own battles. But Hattie wasn't done. Her voice grew firmer. "What I'm telling you isn't just about the past. It's about the man he became because of those struggles." She paused, scanning the crowd, letting the silence stretch just long enough. But what Hattie shared next would go beyond their bond, pulling back the curtain on sacrifices none of them could have imagined. Hattie's hands clenched tightly around her purse, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "We didn't just survive those times. We fought through them. But that fight demanded sacrifices that left marks on both of us, marks most of you would never see. She glanced at the crowd, her piercing eyes meeting theirs as if daring anyone to look away. In 1967, Robert lost his job for attending a march in Selma. The school board called it unbecoming conduct. But we all knew what it really was: retribution. He didn't tell anyone here about it because he didn't want pity. She sighed. He packed up what little he had and moved to a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery. That's where he lived, scraping by on tutoring gigs, never once abandoning the fight. Hattie's voice cracked slightly as she continued. When my own house was firebombed in retaliation for hosting meetings, it was Robert who showed up in the middle of the night with his car. He drove me and my 2 nephews to safety without hesitation, knowing full well the risk. She turned back to the casket, her expression softening. That's who Robert was. Not the polished man in the tailored suit most of you remember, but someone who walked through fire for the people he cared about. The crowd stood in silence, captivated, as she pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse. This, she said, holding it up, is a letter Robert wrote to me in 1972. I want to read just one part to you. Hattie unfolded the letter with care, her hands shaking just enough to show how much it meant to her. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling but clear. Hattie, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you, without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back. Her voice broke on the last line, and she paused to regain her composure. The crowd, previously so stoic, now shifted visibly, some dabbing at their eyes, others staring at the ground in shame for not knowing this side of the man they had come to honor. Hattie folded the letter again. Robert never turned his back on anyone, she said. Not even when it cost him everything. And yet, how many of you here knew any of this? How many of you cared enough to ask? She let the question hang, the weight of her words pressing on the group like a heavy fog. But as the truth of Robert's sacrifices sank in, Hattie revealed something even more profound, an act of courage that would redefine his legacy forever. Hattie pressed on, her words laced with both sorrow and defiance. There's one more truth about Robert, a truth none of you would have guessed, yet it's one that shaped everything he stood for. The crowd tensed, hanging on her every word as she took a steadying breath. Robert didn't just fight for others. He fought a battle no one could see. For years, he hid the fact that he was supporting a child, a son he couldn't openly claim because of who the mother was. A collective gasp rippled through the group. Hattie's eyes swept the stunned faces, but she pressed forward without hesitation. His son, Samuel, was born to a woman Robert couldn't marry because of the time and place they lived in. The boy was black, like me, and Robert was forced to keep it quiet for fear of what it would do to his career and reputation in certain circles. The whispers grew louder now, people exchanging glances of disbelief, but Hattie wasn't finished. I was there when Samuel was born, she said softly, and Robert made sure that boy never went without. He paid for his schooling, wrote letters every week, and visited whenever he could under the cover of darkness. He made sure Samuel had everything he never had growing up. A father's love, even if it had to be a quiet love. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice stayed strong. And Samuel, the man you didn't know existed, is here today. At that, a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. His presence was commanding, with broad shoulders and a quiet dignity in the way he moved. The resemblance to Robert was unmistakable. The crowd turned to stare, stunned into silence. Samuel walked up to Hattie and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Hattie smiled at him through her tears. "It was always my honor." She turned back to the group, addressing them once more. "Robert loved all of you in his way, but his truest love was in the people he fought for. Those of us who didn't have the luxury of being seen in polite society. That's why I'm here today, to make sure you know the real man behind all the accolades." The silence that followed wasn't just shock. It was reflection, a reckoning with the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. But before the mourners could fully process what they'd learned, Hattie had one final story to share. A moment of bravery that would define Robert's legacy forever. The crowd stood frozen, the weight of Hattie's words settling over them like a blanket too heavy to shake off. The murmurs that had filled the air earlier were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. All eyes were on Samuel, who stood tall and resolute beside Hattie, his presence a living testament to the secrets Robert had carried. An older man near the front of the group cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. I never knew," he stammered. "Robert never said a word about any of this." Hattie's gaze softened as she looked at him. "He wasn't the kind of man to seek praise for doing what was right," she said. "But make no mistake, he carried the weight of these sacrifices every single day." A middle-aged woman, her face streaked with tears, stepped forward hesitantly. "I remember him helping my family when my father lost his job," she said quietly. "I thought I understood his kindness, but now it feels so much deeper." Hattie nodded, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Robert didn't just give out of convenience. He gave because he understood what it meant to go without, and he never wanted anyone to feel that same pain." The group began to stir, fragments of their own memories of Robert bubbling to the surface. Each story shared painted a picture of a man whose generosity and strength were rooted in a life few of them had truly understood. But it wasn't just the memories that hung in the air. It was the guilt. Many began to realize they had only known the polished version of Robert, the man who wore his success like a shield to protect the truth of his struggles. A young man near the back finally spoke up, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's not fair," he said, his hands clenching into fists. "He deserved to be celebrated for everything, not just the parts we wanted to see." Hattie turned to him, her expression softening. "You're right," she said. "But Robert wasn't a man who cared about credit. He cared about impact. And his greatest legacy isn't the plaques on the walls or the accolades in your programs. It's the lives he touched. Yours, mine, and Samuel's." Samuel stepped forward then, his voice low but firm. "My father always told me that the measure of a person isn't what they leave behind in things. It's what they leave behind in people. And standing here today, I see that he left behind more than I ever imagined." The crowd seemed to breathe as one, their collective guilt giving way to a deeper understanding of the man they had come to mourn. Tears fell freely now, not just for Robert's passing but for the profound realization of his unseen sacrifices. But as the crowd began to grasp the full weight of Robert's life, Hattie prepared to share one final story, a moment that would leave them forever changed. Hattie took a moment to steady herself, her hands clasped tightly together as she gazed out at the crowd. The air was heavy, not with sorrow alone, but with a newfound respect for the man they thought they had known. Yet there was one more story she needed to share. A final act of Robert's life that would define his legacy. 2 months before Robert passed, she began, her voice softer now, "He called me. He wasn't well, but his spirit hadn't faltered. He told me he was putting together a trust. Not for himself or his estate, but for the children in this community. Children whose parents struggle to make ends meet. Children who deserve opportunities but are often overlooked." The crowd stirred again, their expressions a mix of surprise and awe. "He knew he wouldn't live to see the trust in action," Hattie continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But he didn't care about that. What mattered to him was planting the seed, making sure it would grow long after he was gone." Samuel stepped forward, his deep voice adding to his mother's words. "That trust is real," he said firmly. "It's already been established, and it's going to provide scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorship for kids in need. My father wanted his life to mean something. Not just to the people he knew, but to the generations that would come after him." Hattie looked around, her gaze meeting each mourner's eyes. "That was Robert's greatest gift," she said. "He didn't need recognition or applause. He just needed to know he had done his part to make the world a little better." A long silence followed, the weight of her words settling into the hearts of everyone present. Some nodded quietly, others wiped away tears, and a few simply stood still, lost in thought. Hattie placed her hand on the polished headstone, her voice growing softer but no less resolute. So now I leave you with this. How will you be remembered? Not for the things you had, or the titles you earned, but for the lives you touched and the love you gave. She turned back to the crowd, her expression kind but firm. If Robert taught us anything, it's that true legacy isn't written in stone. It's written in the hearts of the people you lift up. The crowd seemed to exhale collectively, the emotional weight giving way to quiet reflection. Hattie gave a final nod to Samuel before stepping back, letting the moment settle. As the mourners began to disperse, many approached Hattie and Samuel, offering words of gratitude and promises to honor Robert's legacy. The cemetery, once a place of somber finality, had become a space of renewed purpose. The mourners lingered, their steps slow as they processed what they had just learned. Conversations were hushed, spoken in tones of regret and admiration. Some approached Samuel, offering condolences not just for the loss of his father but for the years of silence that had separated them. Others turned to Hattie, their eyes filled with questions they hadn't thought to ask before today. A woman in a navy blue dress wiped her eyes and spoke hesitantly. I always knew Robert was kind, but I had no idea. I wish I had known him the way you did. Hattie offered a small, knowing smile. You knew a part of him, she said gently. We all did. But people are like rivers, deep, complex, and always moving. You only see what's on the surface unless you take the time to look deeper. The woman nodded, pressing a hand over her heart. I just hope he knew how much we all loved him. Hattie's gaze softened. He did. And that was enough for him. Nearby, an older man with gray at his temples shifted uneasily. He had been one of Robert's closest business partners, but today, he felt like a stranger in the story of his life. I sat with him in boardrooms, he murmured, half to himself. We built projects together. We made decisions that shaped this town. And yet, I never knew what shaped him. Hattie studied him for a moment before speaking. Sometimes, men like Robert didn't share their burdens because they weren't looking for sympathy. They carried them because they knew if they put them down, no one else would pick them up. The man exhaled heavily, nodding. He was always steady. Always there when you needed him. I just wish I had asked about what he needed. Samuel, who had been silent for most of the interactions, finally spoke. I think he understood, he said. But the best way to honor him now is to carry forward what he believed in. Not just in words, but in actions. A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. One by one, people placed flowers on the grave, some whispering their own quiet apologies, others simply standing in silent reflection. The weight of history, of sacrifice, and of love unspoken settled over them like a heavy quilt. As the last of the mourners prepared to leave, an elderly woman, frail yet sharp-eyed, approached Hattie. Her voice was soft but firm. You spoke of Robert's sacrifices, of what he gave up, she said. But I need to ask, do you think he was happy? The question hung in the air. Hattie didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Samuel, then at the grave, then back at the woman. Happiness is a strange thing, she finally said. It isn't always about ease or comfort. It's about purpose. And Robert had that in abundance. He didn't live an easy life, but he lived a meaningful one. And that, in its own way, is happiness. The woman nodded, as if that was the answer she had been searching for. A light breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves, carrying with it a sense of quiet resolution. Hattie turned to Samuel. Are you ready? Samuel took one last look at his father's resting place, then nodded. Yes. As they walked away, the world felt a little different. Not just because of what had been revealed, but because of what had been understood. Robert Henley's story hadn't ended with his passing. In truth, it had only just begun. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only a few stragglers lost in thought. Hattie and Samuel stood side by side, neither speaking for a long moment. Samuel finally exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I spent my whole life thinking I was a secret," he murmured. "An afterthought. But now I see, I was a choice. He chose to love me, even when the world wouldn't let him." Hattie turned to him, her eyes warm with understanding. "You were never a secret to him," she said gently. "You were his greatest responsibility. And his greatest love." Samuel swallowed hard, nodding. "I just wish I had more time." Hattie reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Time is never enough," she said. "But love doesn't end just because a person is gone. He's still with you, in everything he left behind." Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. As they made their way toward the cemetery gates, a voice called out from behind them. "Wait." They turned to see a man approaching. He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a hesitant expression. I wanted to say something," the man said, shifting on his feet. "My name is David. I worked with Robert for years. And I feel ashamed today." Samuel and Hattie remained silent, waiting. David ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I sat next to him in meetings. I called him my friend. And yet, I never knew him. Not really. I only saw what he let me see." Hattie studied him for a moment before speaking. "Robert didn't hide himself to deceive you," she said softly. "He did it because the world didn't always make space for men like him. He wasn't ashamed. He was protecting something precious." David nodded, his eyes glassy with emotion. "I see that now. And I want to do better. I want to be better. Not just for him, but for the people like him, people I've overlooked." Hattie's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "Then start now." David straightened his posture, as if a weight had been lifted. "I will." He extended a hand toward Samuel. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. And if there's ever anything I can do, I'd like to be there." Samuel hesitated for only a second before shaking his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. As David walked away, Hattie and Samuel exchanged a look. "One person at a time," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "That's how real change happens." They reached the car, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Samuel turned the key in the ignition but didn't drive off right away. Instead, he looked out the window at the fading daylight. "What happens now?" he asked. Hattie smiled. "Now, we live. We honor him by living the way he did, with purpose, with love, and with courage." Samuel considered that, then nodded. And as they drove away, the cemetery behind them bathed in the golden hues of sunset, they carried with them not just the memory of Robert Henley, but the legacy of a man who had quietly changed the world one life at a time. Hattie and Samuel drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. The weight of the day, the revelations, and the emotions still hung in the air like an unshakable presence. Samuel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's strange, isn't it? How a person can live their whole life, touch so many people, and still have parts of themselves no one ever truly sees." Hattie nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "That's the nature of sacrifice," she said. "It's rarely done for recognition. The truest sacrifices are made in the quiet, in the spaces where no one is watching." Samuel gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "All those years, I thought my father didn't care. That he had moved on, built a life without me. But he was always there, just in ways I didn't understand." Hattie turned to him, her expression gentle. "Love doesn't always look the way we expect it to," she said. "But that doesn't make it any less real. Samuel exhaled, shaking his head slightly. I just keep thinking, how different things would have been if he could have been open about me. If he didn't have to hide. Hattie sighed, staring out the window as the city lights flickered to life in the distance. He made choices, she said. Some to protect you, some to protect himself. Maybe some he regretted. But the love was never in question. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a small nod, he said, I want to know more. About him. About you. About everything he stood for. Hattie smiled. Then I'll tell you. And so, as they drove through the winding streets, past buildings filled with memories and streets lined with untold stories, Hattie began to speak. She told Samuel about the first time she met Robert, how he had shown up to a community meeting, the only white man in a room full of black activists, unafraid but unsure of his place. She told him about the nights they spent planning protests, the quiet moments in between where Robert had shared his dreams, his fears, and his unwavering belief that the world could be better. She spoke of the danger, the threats, the nights when they had feared for their lives but pressed forward anyway. She spoke of the kindness he had shown when no one was watching. How he had quietly paid off debts for struggling families, how he had written letters to politicians demanding justice, how he had risked everything, his job, his safety, his future, because he refused to stand by while others suffered. Samuel listened, hanging on to every word, each story painting a fuller picture of the man he had barely known. And as the night stretched on, as the miles passed beneath them, something shifted in Samuel's heart. For the first time in his life, he didn't just know he had a father. He understood him. Months passed, but the weight of that day never left them. Samuel and Hattie became inseparable, bound by their love for Robert and the truth of his legacy. Samuel took time off from work, traveling to the places his father had once fought for, meeting people who had known him in ways he never had. He visited the old church in Montgomery where Robert had once stood alongside Hattie, where they had planned sit-ins and marches that would change history. He met elders who still remembered his father's name, who spoke of him with reverence and sorrow, recalling the sacrifices he had made, the pain he had endured for a cause greater than himself. At every stop, Samuel collected pieces of his father's life, piecing together the man behind the name. Hattie, too, found herself revisiting old memories, writing down the stories she had once only carried in her heart. She wanted to make sure that Robert's story, the real story, was never forgotten. And then, one evening, as they sat in Hattie's small, cluttered living room, Samuel made a decision. I want to start a foundation, he said, his voice firm with purpose. Something in his name. Something that keeps his work alive. Hattie studied him for a moment, then nodded. He'd like that, she said simply. And so, the Robert Henley Legacy Foundation was born. It started small, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, a mentorship program for young activists. But as the word spread, as people learned the truth about Robert's life, the support grew. Donations poured in. Community leaders stepped forward. Old friends who had never known the full depth of Robert's sacrifices came to honor him in the only way that truly mattered, by continuing his fight. Samuel stood at the forefront, carrying his father's mission forward, no longer a hidden secret but a proud testament to the man Robert had been. And as the years passed, as the foundation grew, as lives were changed in his father's name, Samuel no longer felt the ache of lost time. Because in every child who received a scholarship, in every young activist who found their voice, in every person who was lifted up because of Robert's sacrifice, his father lived on. And in that, Samuel found peace. Samuel dedicated himself to the foundation with an intensity that surprised even him. He had spent so many years disconnected from his father's memory, feeling like an outsider in his own history, but now he had a purpose. He traveled across the country, speaking at events, meeting with community leaders, and sharing his father's story. Each time he spoke, he saw the way people's eyes softened, the way they leaned in, absorbing the weight of Robert Henley's sacrifices. There were times when he felt overwhelmed. The work was relentless, the burden of carrying on a legacy so profound sometimes too heavy to bear. But every time he doubted himself, He thought of his father, of the nights Robert must have spent wondering if his efforts would ever make a difference. Samuel realized that his father's work had not been about immediate rewards. It had been about faith, about planting seeds he might never see grow. One evening, Samuel sat in Hattie's living room, surrounded by old newspaper clippings, letters, and photographs. They had spent weeks sorting through Robert's belongings, trying to preserve the history he had never shared. Hattie handed him a worn leather journal, its pages filled with his father's neat, deliberate handwriting. He wrote everything down, she said. His thoughts, his fears, his dreams. Samuel hesitated before opening it. For years, he had longed to hear his father's words, to understand the man he had never truly known. Now, with the journal in his hands, he felt both eager and afraid. He turned to the first page and read aloud. I do not know if history will remember me, but I do not need it to. What matters is that I was here, that I did something, that I stood for something. If I can make the world a little better for those who come after me, then I have done enough. Samuel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He flipped through the pages, finding passages about protests, about the students his father had mentored, about the moments of doubt that had threatened to consume him. I am afraid sometimes, Robert had written. Not for myself, but for those I love. I fear that my choices will hurt them. That my silence about my son will one day cause him pain. But I do what I must. I hope one day he understands. Samuel closed his eyes, gripping the journal tightly. He had spent so many years resenting the distance, feeling abandoned, but now he saw it for what it was. His father had not chosen to leave him behind. He had chosen to protect him, to love him in the only way the world would allow. Hattie reached over and rested a hand on his. He carried you with him, always. Samuel nodded, wiping at his eyes. I want to publish this, he said. Not just for me, but for everyone. People deserve to know who he really was. Hattie smiled. He would have liked that. The process of publishing Robert's journal was not easy. There were those who resisted, who wanted to preserve the polished version of Robert Henley, the philanthropist, the businessman. But Samuel refused to let his father's truth be buried. He worked tirelessly with historians, journalists, and publishers, ensuring that every word, every sacrifice, was honored. When the book was finally released, it sparked conversations across the country. Schools incorporated it into their history lessons. Activists used it as a guide for perseverance. People who had once admired Robert from a distance now understood the depth of his struggle, the weight of his choices. Samuel traveled to Montgomery for a book signing, held in the very church where his father had once organized protests. The line stretched down the block, filled with people who had been touched by Robert's work. Some brought old photographs, others shared stories of how Robert had helped their families. An elderly woman approached the table, her hands trembling as she set down a faded letter. He wrote this to me in 1973, she said softly. I was just a girl then, trying to find my place in a world that didn't want me. He told me to never give up, to fight for my dreams. I did. And I have him to thank for that. Samuel took the letter gently, reading his father's words. They were filled with encouragement, with belief, with love. Thank you for bringing this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The woman patted his hand. Thank you for making sure people know who he really was. As the event came to an end, Samuel stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the warm southern air. He looked around at the city his father had fought for, at the streets that still carried the echoes of protest, of hope, of change. Hattie joined him, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. He'd be proud of you, she said. Samuel smiled, looking up at the night sky. I finally feel like I know him, he admitted. And I feel like, in some way, he knows me too. Hattie nodded. Love like that never fades. It just finds new ways to live on. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded photograph. It was one he had found among his father's belongings, a picture of Robert holding him as a baby, his expression soft and full of love. He didn't have to say it, Samuel murmured. He showed it. Every single day. Hattie smiled, linking her arm through his. "Come on," she said. "We've got more work to do." And as they walked away, Samuel knew that his father's story was far from over. It was only just beginning. Over the following months, the Robert Henley Legacy Foundation grew beyond anything Samuel had anticipated. What had begun as a simple scholarship program expanded into mentorship initiatives, community outreach programs, and nationwide partnerships aimed at uplifting underprivileged youth. Samuel worked tirelessly, traveling from city to city, speaking at universities, community centers, and civil rights gatherings. Each time he shared his father's story, he saw how it changed people. Teachers incorporated Robert Henley's name into their lessons. Parents told their children about a man who had fought for justice not for recognition, but because it was right. Samuel received letters from students whose lives had been transformed by the foundation, young men and women who saw in Robert's story a reflection of their own struggles. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing the latest scholarship applications, his phone buzzed. It was a call from a journalist who had been following the foundation's progress. "We've been researching your father's life," the journalist said. "And we came across something you might want to see." Samuel's stomach tightened. After everything he had learned about his father, he wasn't sure if he was ready for more revelations. "What is it?" he asked. "There's a letter," the journalist said. "It was written by Robert, but it was never sent. We found it in an archive of documents related to the civil rights movement." Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. "Can you send it to me?" Minutes later, an email appeared in his inbox. He hesitated before clicking on it, his heart pounding as he opened the scanned image of the letter. August 4, 1981. My dearest son, I do not know if you will ever read this, but I need to write it. Maybe one day, when the world is different, when you are older, when I am gone, you will find this and understand. I have never once stopped thinking about you. Not a day goes by that I do not wonder what you are doing, what kind of man you are becoming. It is my greatest regret that I could not be the father you deserved. Not because I did not want to, but because the world would not allow it. I fought battles so that you wouldn't have to. I stood in places I was not welcome so that, one day, you might walk freely. I endured silence, not because I did not wish to speak, but because my voice, if used in the wrong moment, could have taken everything from you. I hope you are happy. I hope you are loved. And I hope that, if you ever learn of me, you will know that my distance was not a measure of my love. It was proof of it. With all my heart, your father. Samuel sat back in his chair, the letter still open on the screen, his hands trembling. Hattie, who had been sitting across from him, watching him carefully, finally spoke. "He wrote that for you," she said softly. Samuel nodded, unable to find words. "I spent so long feeling abandoned," he finally whispered. "But he never left me. He was always there." Hattie reached across the desk and took his hand. "Love doesn't always get to look the way we want it to," she said. "But it doesn't mean it isn't real." Tears burned in Samuel's eyes, but for the first time, they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of understanding. "I want this letter published," he said after a long silence. "The world needs to see it." And so, the letter was shared. It spread across newspapers, social media, and history books. It was read at civil rights conferences and universities. People across the country, across generations, saw in Robert's words the echoes of countless sacrifices made in silence. But for Samuel, it was something even greater. It was the final piece of his father's love. Months later, Samuel stood at a dedication ceremony in Montgomery, where a new community center had been named in Robert Henley's honor. As he stepped up to the podium, he looked out over the crowd: students, teachers, activists, families, all gathered because of his father's legacy. He took a deep breath and began to speak. My father never asked for recognition. He never wanted applause. All he wanted was to make the world a little better than he found it. He paused, glancing at the framed copy of the letter that sat beside him on the stage. And he did. Not through fame, not through power, but through love. Quiet, unwavering, relentless love. As he spoke, he saw Hattie smiling proudly from the front row. He saw young students taking notes, their faces filled with inspiration. He saw people who had known his father standing together, some with tears in their eyes. And in that moment, Samuel knew the truth. His father was not gone. His father was everywhere. In the voices of the students who would rise because of him. In the hands of the people who would lift others because of him. In the love that would never fade, because love, true love, never dies. It only grows. And so, as Samuel stepped down from the podium, he did not feel the weight of loss anymore. He felt the weight of legacy. A legacy that would never be forgotten. In the weeks that followed the dedication ceremony, Samuel found himself reflecting on the weight of his father's legacy. The more he learned, the more he realized how deeply Robert Henley had shaped the lives of those around him. His story had reached beyond the walls of their community and into the hearts of people across the country. The Foundation's headquarters, a modest but welcoming space in Montgomery, had become a hub for activists, educators, and students alike. Samuel spent his days meeting with organizers, approving new scholarship recipients, and ensuring that the programs they had started continued to thrive. One afternoon, as he sat in his office reviewing applications, a young woman knocked on the door. She was no older than 20, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Mr. Henley?" she asked hesitantly. Samuel smiled. "Please, call me Samuel. Come in." She stepped inside, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you. I received one of the scholarships from the foundation. I wouldn't be in college right now if it weren't for you, if it weren't for your father." Samuel gestured for her to sit, sensing that she had more to say. "I didn't know much about Robert Henley before," she admitted. "I had read about him, but not in the way you talk about him. When I saw his letter, the one he wrote to you, I cried. Because I know what it's like to feel like you were left behind. And I know now that sometimes, love means making impossible choices." Samuel felt his throat tighten. "I used to wonder if he loved me," he said quietly. "But now I see that love isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's in the sacrifices we don't see until much later." The young woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I just wanted you to know that his story changed me. It made me want to do something bigger with my life. And one day, when I can, I want to give back the way he did." Samuel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's the best way to honor him." As she left, Samuel sat back in his chair, staring at the framed letter on the wall. His father's words had not only given him peace, they had inspired an entire generation. One evening, as he and Hattie sat on the porch of her home, watching the sunset, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I think it's time for you to tell your own story." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? You spent so much time telling your father's story. And that's important. But you have your own journey, too. Your own struggles, your own lessons. Maybe it's time the world hears them." Samuel let the idea settle in his mind. He had always thought of himself as the keeper of his father's history, but maybe Hattie was right. Maybe his own journey, the son who once felt forgotten, the man who had built a legacy out of loss, was just as important. In the months that followed, he began writing. It started with journal entries, late-night thoughts scribbled down between meetings. But as time passed, his words took shape, forming the story of a man who had once been lost and found himself in the echoes of his father's love. By the time the book was finished, it was more than just a memoir. It was a testament to healing, to understanding, to the truth that even in absence, love endures. When it was finally published, Samuel held the first copy in his hands, running his fingers over the title, Echoes of Love, A Son's Journey to His Father's Legacy. At the book's launch event, the room was filled with people who had been touched by his father's story. Samuel stood at the podium, taking a deep breath before speaking. My father taught me that love isn't always about presents. Sometimes, it's in the quiet things. The sacrifices. The choices. The battles fought in silence. He looked out at the crowd, at Hattie, at the students who were now walking a path his father had helped pave. And now, I understand that his love didn't end when he passed. It continues. In me. In all of you. In every life he changed. The applause was deafening, but Samuel didn't need it. He had already found what he had been searching for. As he stepped down from the stage, a sense of peace washed over him. His father's story had been told. His own story had begun. And together, they would live on. The success of Samuel's book was beyond anything he had imagined. It was not just a bestseller, it became a movement. People from all walks of life, students, historians, activists, even those who had once resisted acknowledging Robert Henley's full legacy, read it and found themselves changed. The story of a father's silent sacrifices and a son's journey to understanding resonated deeply, touching hearts across the country. Samuel was invited to speak at universities, civil rights events, and book festivals. Every time he stepped onto a stage, he felt a new kind of connection, not just to his father, but to the people who saw themselves in his story. One evening, after a long day of interviews and meetings, Samuel sat in his office at the foundation, looking out at the city lights. He had done so much in the past few years, establishing the foundation, publishing the book, sharing his father's truth, but something inside him still felt unfinished. As he stared at the framed letter from his father, he realized what it was. He needed to go to the place where his father had once struggled the most. He needed to go back to Montgomery. Hattie was hesitant when he told her his plan. You've already done so much, Samuel, she said. You've honored him in every way possible. I know, he said, but I need to see it for myself. I need to walk where he walked. I need to stand where he stood. Hattie studied him for a moment before nodding. Then I'm coming with you. A week later, they arrived in Montgomery, driving past streets that had once been battlegrounds for change. Hattie pointed out landmarks, the church where they had planned protests, the school where Robert had once taught, the small apartment where he had lived after losing his job. Each place carried its own weight, its own echoes of history. Samuel found himself standing outside his father's old apartment, the door weathered but still sturdy. He closed his eyes and imagined Robert there, alone, trying to rebuild his life. He thought about the nights his father must have spent writing letters he could never send, wondering if his son would ever know the truth. And in that moment, Samuel felt something shift inside him. His father's sacrifices were not just a story in a book. They were real. They were alive in the very ground he stood on. Later that evening, Hattie took him to a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was a place she and Robert had often met to talk in secret, away from the eyes of those who disapproved of their friendship. As they ate, an elderly man approached their table. He wore a suit that had seen better days, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned on his cane. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough with age. "Are you Robert Henley's boy?" Samuel nodded. The man smiled, his eyes misty. "I knew your father," he said. "We marched together in Selma. He was one of the bravest men I ever met." Samuel felt his chest tighten. "Thank you," he said. The man pulled out an old photograph from his coat pocket and handed it to Samuel. It was a picture of Robert, younger, standing on the steps of a church with a small group of activists. He looked tired but determined, his arm around a younger Hattie, his other hand holding a sign that read "Justice for All." "I thought you might want to have this," the man said. He never wanted credit, never wanted to be the one in front. But he was always there. Always. Samuel traced his fingers over the edges of the photograph, his vision blurring. "Thank you," he whispered. The man patted his shoulder before turning to leave. Hattie watched Samuel carefully. "I think you found what you were looking for," she said softly. Samuel exhaled slowly, nodding. "I think I did." That night, as he sat in his hotel room, he placed the photograph next to his father's letter. Two pieces of history, two pieces of love, finally brought together. And as he closed his eyes, he knew his father was not just a memory. He was a part of him. A part of everything Samuel had become. And in that, Robert Henley would live forever. Samuel woke early the next morning, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He had come to Montgomery seeking understanding, seeking some final piece of his father's life that would make everything clear. And now, with the photograph clutched tightly in his hand, he felt that clarity settling over him like the first light of dawn. Hattie was already awake, sitting at the small table in their hotel room with a cup of coffee, staring out the window. She glanced at Samuel as he sat across from her, a knowing look in her eyes. "You didn't sleep much," she observed. He shook his head. "Too much on my mind." She nodded, taking a slow sip of her coffee before speaking. That's how it was for him, too. Robert never had the luxury of peace. Even when things were good, he was always thinking about the next battle, the next fight, the next person he needed to help. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "I don't know how he did it," he admitted. How he kept going, knowing that so much of what he was fighting for, he might never live to see. Hattie set down her cup, leaning forward. Because he believed in something bigger than himself. "And now, Samuel, so do you." He let her words sink in, feeling their truth settle in his bones. That morning, they visited the last place on their list, the cemetery where Robert had been buried. It was a modest grave, tucked away in a quiet corner, shaded by the branches of an old oak tree. Samuel stood in front of the headstone, tracing his fingers over the engraved words. Robert Henley 1945 to 2002, a life of service and sacrifice. He knelt down, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his fingertips. "Hey, Dad," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I finally made it." Hattie stepped back, giving him space as he sat there in silence. He thought about everything he had learned, every piece of his father's life that had been hidden in the shadows, now finally brought into the light. He thought about the sacrifices, the love, the choices that had defined Robert Henley's life. And then, for the first time, he spoke without hesitation, without doubt, without the weight of resentment clouding his heart. "I forgive you," he whispered. "I understand now." A breeze rustled through the trees, and for a brief moment, Samuel swore he could feel something, a presence, a warmth, a quiet reassurance. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. When he finally stood, Hattie gave him a small, proud smile. "You ready to go?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah." As they walked away from the grave, Samuel didn't feel the ache of loss anymore. He felt something else entirely. He felt whole. Back in Montgomery, the city was alive with movement. People hurried through the streets, voices filled the air, and the world kept turning, just as it always had. But for Samuel, something had changed. He no longer felt like an outsider in his father's story. He was part of it now. A week later, back at the Foundation's headquarters, Samuel stood before a gathering of students, activists, and community members. It was the largest event they had hosted yet, a celebration of the work Robert Henley had started and the legacy that was now being carried forward. Samuel stepped up to the podium, taking a slow breath before speaking. "When I was young, I thought my father was a stranger to me," he began. "I thought he had chosen a life without me, that I had been left behind." He glanced at Hattie in the front row, her eyes shining with encouragement. "But I know now that love isn't always about presence. Sometimes, love is sacrifice. Sometimes, it's making choices that can never be explained, because the world isn't ready to understand them. The room was silent, every person hanging on his words. My father didn't just fight for justice. He fought for people. He fought for me, even when I didn't know it. And now, I stand here today, not just as his son, but as his legacy. A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. So today, I ask you, what will your legacy be? What will you fight for, even if no one sees it? Even if no one thanks you? Even if history never writes your name? The applause was deafening, but Samuel barely heard it. All he felt was the overwhelming sense of fulfillment, of finally stepping into the role he had unknowingly been preparing for his entire life. As the event ended and people came up to shake his hand, to share their own stories of struggle and perseverance, Samuel looked around the room. He saw his father everywhere. In the students who were finding their voices. In the teachers who were dedicating their lives to shaping young minds. In the activists who refused to stop fighting, even when the world tried to silence them. And in that moment, Samuel realized something. Robert Henley had never been alone in his fight. And neither was he. That night, as Samuel sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline, he picked up the photograph of his father, the one the old man in Montgomery had given him. He traced the lines of his father's face, his strong, determined eyes, his quiet but unwavering strength. Then, he picked up a pen and opened a fresh page in his journal. He didn't hesitate as he began to write. Dear Dad, I hope you can see me now. I hope you know that everything you fought for, everything you gave up, wasn't in vain. I used to be angry. I used to think you had left me behind. But now I understand. Now I see you, truly see you, for the first time. I promise I'll keep fighting. I'll keep carrying your name forward. I won't let the world forget who you were, what you stood for. You are not gone. You never were. You are here, in every life you touched. And you will always be here, in me. With love, always, your son. He set the pen down, exhaling slowly. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked up at the stars. And for the first time in his life, he felt his father looking back. Not as a shadow, not as a memory, but as a light that would never fade. A legacy that would never die. The end.